They didn't die because anybody shot them. They died from the fact that they were unable to function appropriately, to take care of themselves, to function as a community. They no longer had what you got to have and what black folk had taken from them through meritorious manumission. See, once you get a community, the next thing you must have above that is your trust. You cannot have trust if you don't have a community. I always hear black folks say, Dr. Evans, all the things you say are true, but how can I get together another black folk when I don't trust them? You don't trust them because you don't have a community. And and above trust comes cooperation. But Dr. Evans, I don't want to work with him. No, because you don't trust him. So it goes community, trust, cooperation. And that's what they did in Korea. They killed the community. The black soldiers no longer had a community, and prisoners no longer had a sense of a community. They no longer had a sense of who they were, what they were about, the business of, and who they were. And all of a sudden, that kind of an oppressive system of rewarding people for identifying with the enemy, and that's what the Koreans were doing, saying, you identify with us, and we'll reward you and give you a can and an apple. And when they started rewarding people, the community was destroyed. And their soldiers fell apart, and over half of them died. And so the next thing that happened to them is what also happened to the black community. After 1710, they moved into a thing what we call give-up-itis. All of a sudden, the soldiers in Korea, in those camps, no longer cared about anything anymore. So when I come into the Crenshaw district and I said, why don't you do this? They said, well, we don't care anymore. Same thing happened in the prisoner of war camps. The soldiers didn't care. And once they lost caring, they were through. Nobody could save them anymore. And at night, over 40% of those soldiers would pull blankets over their head and just sit there in the corner and die for no apparent reason. Not for physical reasons. It was called give-up-itis, and you've seen it in hospitals. That's when a person would die long before he's supposed to. And you ask why. When a husband passed and the wife would die 6 months later, 3 months later. Not for any medical reason, because they no longer have a will to live. And that's what happened in those camps. We lost over half our soldiers because they lost their will to live. And see, after meritorious manumission was put on black folk in 1710, black folk, a lot of them began to lose their will to live and to care and be responsible. So jumping back to 1710, so you understand what brainwashing is and the effect on black folk, I want you all to understand that was a re-educational system. So when that happened in 1710, the word spread. And down in Jamaica, there was a fellow named Willie Lynch that heard about it. And he was already running a seasoning school for slaves in the South, in Jamaica. So then he caught a boat and headed for America, headed for Virginia, where the meritorious manumission had been initially enacted. He got there in 1712. And just like the communists did in Korea, he came up with the same expression, gentlemen, I'm here to take care of your needs. I can show you how to do what you want to have done. I can show you how to divide these slaves so they'll never recover, or at least it'll take 300 years before they can do it. So some of you might wonder why I picked in my book the year 2013. This coming year in 2013 would be almost exactly 300 years since Willie Lynch put his methods on black folk. He said it would take 300 years. He said, what I'll do is to show you how you divide blacks. You divide blacks along the lines of skin color. You rig it so every black will look at another black skin color first and say, is he a yellow black or black black? And that way you've already divided them. You divide them along the lines of sex, so that all of a sudden you have black women joining the feminist movement against their own black men. They're trying to beat them out of jobs and opportunity and visibility to take care of their families. So you divide them along the lines of sex. Then you divide them along the lines of age, where the old turn against the young turn against the old and say, you're ancient, you're old, I don't want to listen to you anymore. And it worked very effectively. And Willie Lynch put that on them. It's called divide and conquer. Divide and conquer was the same in 1710 as it was in 1950 in Korea. And black folk became invited. And so from 1750 up to about from 1710 up to 1750, the system started going into effect. The social conditioning, the brainwashing of black folk took off full steam then. Because see now, they were very concerned about all these black slaves. We had to control them. And people said, well, how are we going to control them? And said the first way, and there are three ways you do it, but the first way is by physical control. Always control a black person physically. That's what slavery is about. The second way of controlling them was called Jim Crowism. Then you control them legally. Then the third way you control them is when we came out of the civil rights movement, which means symbolically. You control them by manipulating symbols. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So they went into the first thing of controlling black folk physically with slavery. By 1750, the black population got up to 34% in America. And they were very concerned about this because you see all these slaves were pouring in across the water, so they started advertising to bring in more immigrants. They said, what we need are more white immigrants to dilute. Remember I told you the Diversity Act said we must have so many whites. So we got to have an immigration law that bring in more whites to neutralize blacks out, to keep them contained, to keep them as a minority. We'll fix it so they'll love that word minority. They'll use it all the time and call themselves that. Even though we know the minority means loser. We'll turn the world upside down, they'll call themselves loser, loser, loser. So by 1750, black population hit 34%. So what the white society started doing then, it says, we must do what they didn't say that then, but the effect was the same. What happened in Korea? We must isolate them. So every Indian treaty from that point on started putting in conclusions saying that you must also stay away from black folk. They built into all the Indian treaties incentives for them not to identify with black folk because they feared that if Indians and blacks got together, they could overthrow the country. So Indians were given incentives then to turn against black people. And that's why later on you find that the biggest killers of black folk for a long period of time were Indians, because they were given incentives. For instance, if you raided a town or a village, guess who was the first person you run into in the fields? Was a black person. And see, and you had laws because the slave codes of 1705 says a black person could not arm himself, he couldn't carry a weapon, he couldn't carry a tool, he could not raise his hand to defend himself, he could not strike back. So Indians said, hey, we got a good guy to raid. I mean, this is like shooting ducks. And the whites knew that. When they put the blacks out in the field, they used blacks for burglar alarms. So every time there was an Indian raid, they the ones who went down first. And that's why all the 5 civilized tribes in America then became slaveholders. All the 5 civilized Indian tribes were slaveholders. Not only were they slaveholders, they were slave traders. And more important than that, in all the treaties, typically in a treaty, they paid the Indians $20 for every runaway slave they chased down and brought him back. And that's why also when the Civil War came, all the 5 civilized tribes in America fought with the side of the South to prefer slavery because they didn't want to lose their money and wealth either. And I still have blacks running around saying, well, I'm half Indian. Nobody wants to be black. I mean, even if here's people that have been misusing your people too, but you don't want to be it. They'll tell me about how, well, I'm 3/4 white. I can't stand black folk. I'm 3/4 white. I said, well, why would you want to be white rather than blacks? I said, blacks didn't enslave you. Blacks didn't Jim Crow you. Blacks didn't castrate and lynch you and exploit you. And see, that's that upside down, we make black folks see things upside down and wrong. It's inappropriate behavior. Inappropriate behavior pattern was instituted on us to make sure we saw everything backwards. That way when we ran, we thought we were running the right way, we were running the wrong way, and they knew it. And that's why you later hear me tell black folk all over America that my people, black folk, are doing everything wrong. They're not even doing wrong right. Because you see everything is pointed upside down for us, so they can't see which way to run. And so at that time, in 1750s, the colonies then tried to figure out how to contain the whole issue. So we got our controls in place, we got the social conditioning in place, and I think we got blacks pretty well where we need them. We got them nailed down. So then they then started telling England, don't send any more slaves over here to make sure it works. So Continental Congress sent all kinds of letters to England saying, don't send any more slaves to make sure our system of control works. But England said, no, I'm going to keep sending them because we're getting rich off of it. England said, we're making a fabulous amount of money because we set up the Navigation Act in 1650, which says, I don't care what you all produce in America, it must come back to England first to be processed, and you all buy it back from us. And when you buy it back from us, we're going to charge you 3 or 4 times the price of it. And so when England decided to have a Revolutionary War to break away from England, they didn't put that in the history book, what the real reason they want to break away from England was for. 1, because they were scared to death of black folk getting free over here and tying them with the Indians. 2, they wanted to reverse that whole shipping process, saying if we made all the products in America, we raised the cotton, the corn, the beans, the rice, and everything, why are we sending it to you and buying it back from you? So that's what the Revolutionary War was over. And plus, England was also getting rich off the slaves because, England was only paying $25 to $35 a piece for every slave they were buying on the west coast of Africa. $25 to $35 a piece. But they created a system called capitalism, which says that I also want a 1,500% return on my money, my investment, which means if I pay $25 for a black slave in West Africa, I want to be able to sell them in America for $400 to $500 a piece. And so England was becoming a very rich and powerful nation. It's like most of it. But that was not only England, but you had all the other slave countries became rich. That was Portugal, Spain, England, Germany, and the Arab nations. All of them were becoming wealthy off of black folk, off a combination of 2 things, extracting the wealth out of Africa, the material wealth, and selling the human labor. And after the Revolutionary War, the first act of Congress, as soon as they set up a Congress in the United States, the first act of Congress said, let's solve this problem with the slaves. So the first thing they did was pass what they call the First Immigration Act that says this is a white nation, and the quota on blacks coming here other than as a slave is 0. 0, zip, none, nothing. And that stayed in effect until 1966, when it was raised to 1/2 of 1%. And I still see black folk displaying inappropriate behavior. They can't figure out why you cannot get Haitians into the country. I said, God knows, don't you know what your law is? The reason you cannot get Haitians into the country because they're still fearful of you getting a large, significant black population and being a threat to the society. I said, anytime you got boats floating around off the west coast of Africa for 3 months, you had over 3,000, 4,000 blacks on there who were sick, starving to death. Not one single country offered to bring them in, not this country. At the same time, this country has had refugee programs for every racial and ethnic extraction on earth but black folk. And where's our civil rights leaders? Where's our black leadership? Why aren't they raising issues about it? Instead of them going down there and say, why can't blacks come in from the islands and from Haiti? They do the same thing because they're seeing things upside down and backwards. They do the same thing the whites do. Say, well, what we need to do is invade that country and make them stay there. Let's improve the conditions there. And so that way they have nice places there. Rather than say, no, you didn't improve all the conditions in Mexico, and El Salvador, and Nicaragua, and Hungary, and all these other countries when the people came in. You didn't improve all the conditions in Vietnam to bring in the people. Why do you keep asking these special things, blacks? No leadership will raise the questions. Because you see, no black leadership in America wants to raise the real issues about why we cannot raise our population and others can. In a social democracy where the majority will win and the minority will lose, we are the only planned, systematically, permanently classified minority. Which means that we are the only people who will always lose based on immigration laws and the quotas coming into this country. Unless we start to develop some very specific ways of dealing with it. That's what powernomics is about. I start telling you got to start changing the rules, turn things back upside down. You got to always practice how do you get to be the majority. Never do anything where you're going to be a minority. Do it where you're going to become the majority. Don't move to be a minority, move to be a majority. And we're going to talk about that a little later on how you play these games and learn how to win in powernomics. But you see, as I said, by 1790, the law had locked us out as the only permanent loser. And they said that anybody losing in society from now on, it would be black people. They're the only people that cannot increase their population significantly to be a threat to this country. By the late part of the 1790s, they said, what other kind of external controls can we put on black folk? Because now some of them want to learn, some of them want to try to join the religious movement in this country. And in religion, we say that everybody's a brother. And if we baptize them and make them a Christian, how do we deal with that fact? So they passed a law saying that Christianity did not relieve your heathenism for a black person. And they did not want, after that time, there few blacks had been going to church, but they were sitting in white churches, and they had to be monitored and watched, as I told you, because of the Diversity Act. So when the evangelical movement started moving through this country in the turn of the first of the 1800s, early 1800s, they said, we'll let blacks have their churches, but we can always also, but we must pick the ministers, and we must license the ministers. We must pick ministers that we can control. No black preacher can come into America unless he is controlled by the white establishment, unless he represents our interests and our values, unless he teaches our form of Christianity. Now, this is very important. Why? Because, you see, before, religion was always used to help a population group. When it comes to blacks, we cannot let religion be used to help them. You see, the Catholics, church took care of all those groups who call themselves Catholics. Jews, priests, took care of the Jews. And even today, you go into the conflicts in England or Ireland, where you see the Protestants and the Catholics fighting. I guarantee you that the Protestant members will be representing their people and protecting them. I guarantee you that the Catholic priests will be representing the Catholics and protecting them. If I take you into the Middle East with the Arabs, I guarantee you Khomeini will be taking care of Arabs. Only in America can I find black ministers who can be bought and sold to be against their own people. Nobody else will let you do that. No population will tolerate that except our people. And that's what I call inappropriate behavior. Inappropriate behavior pattern when you let your own ministers sell you out. It's not in your best interest. What I mean by sell you out is because by the early 1800s, the whites said, well, we're going to have black ministers. We're going to have to Christian them to make sure they do what we want to have done. They must teach Christianity the way we want it taught, to where it is an external control device on black folk. They said, what are the rules? One, that every minister we license must teach black folk. When you talk about the slave and the master in the Bible, that you're talking about the white man and the black man on earth. Two, the minister must teach black folk that they're to be loyal, faithful, obedient, respectful, and all those other good things, and honest, so that white people don't have to worry about them stealing as a slave. Because, you know, black slaves had a nasty habit of going around stealing scraps of food because they were starving to death. And they would tell them they must be industrious. But you see, white folks wanted you to work a little harder. So they used the term, he's a lazy slave. Now, anybody in his right mind got more than a third grade education would say, why would a slave want to be industrial? Why would you want to work hard as a slave? What's in it for you? Are you going to get released early? You can get a pension? Social Security or retirement? But they always got this thing about why he's a lazy slave. I even got a black writer who writes about that day. Part of the problem is the blacks were lazy slaves. He should have been lazy. The third thing they put on you is that, well, the black ministers must also teach them to get pie in the sky after death. They're going to turn their world upside down. So while everybody else is competing to get resources, to get wealth, to get power, black folk are saying, I'm waiting for mine in the sky. They said, well, the role model would be Jesus Christ. Says, Jesus Christ and all the Jews were very powerful people and had money. Solomon was the richest man on earth. You go look at Matthew, I think Matthew 23, when they start talking about the talent, where the different slaves had talents. And two of them went out and developed their talents and multiplied and made something, and one buried and hid his. Because they knew there would be that black one, to be that last one, go out and hide it. Y'all understand what I'm talking about? Now, but during that period of time, though, in the 1800s, when they started putting all the religion on them, they started controlling them, a few blacks said, well, wait a minute now, because something just happened down in Haiti. Now, I know that I can guess in the future, y'all aren't going to let the Haitians into this country. But in the 1800s, what happened was Toussaint Overture. Toussaint Overture took his little band of rabble-rousing blacks in Haiti and beat the devil out of all the French troops. Ran them raggedy. Beat the devil out of them. Now, that was important because, for two reasons. First of all, that is the only time in Western history where the white society blinked and black folk took advantage of them and beat them. Y'all remember that? Only time in history that blacks ever broke free of that conditioning system I told you in 1710, the same one they used again in the Korean War. And again, the reason I want to point out that system to you, that brainwashing system, why is it so important? You all remember this and why it's so important. And that's why I must give the dominant white society praise for this. I mean, there's some very smart people. Very smart. Why did I say that? Because, you see, the people that put that system on black folk in 1710, they had the equivalent of a third or fourth grade education. And here we are today, 250 years later, or 200-some years later, almost 300, and black folk with doctor's degrees and master's degrees can't even figure it out. Now, but little Toussaint Overture down in Haiti, he won his battle, beat him good. Now, when he beat him, though, they finally tricked him and said, well, now that you've beaten us, wouldn't you like to come together and integrate? He went to discuss it with them at a meeting. They captured him, put him on a boat, and shipped him to someplace in Europe, some country in Iceland, one of those, I think Finland or someplace, and they froze him to death up there in the prison. Because he went to co-op, and I told you in Korea and the brainwashing techniques, there's another principle that says that anytime you want to control anybody, I can control anybody who's willing to talk and compromise and discuss with me. I can get him to compromise. And see, what we're trying to teach our soldiers was called a code of conduct in Korea, which says never talk to your enemy unless it's on your turf and your terms. And see, right now, I'm assistant police commissioner, I'm working as a therapist for prisoners. Anytime I get somebody to communicate and talk with me, I got him. If he'll speak to me and answer my questions, I got him. Sooner or later, he's going to break down and tell me what I want him to know. The way you resist is you don't communicate. You don't compromise your principles. They can never beat you then. And see, and that's how they got Overture. They asked him, don't you want some integration? Just like they told our leaders the same thing. Now, there were some other blacks who jumped up and said, I'm not going to go for that okie doke. And one of the first ones in 1800 was Gabriel Prosser. Gabriel was an extremely smart black guy. He says, I just heard about what Toussaint Overture did down in the islands. And said, if Toussaint can do it, I'm going to do it here. He said, I'm going to do the same thing. And he did some planning and you couldn't believe. He worked, he planned, he schemed. Prosser really worked on his thing. And he planned one of the most devastatingly, strategically well-planned insurrections on earth. Now, but before I tell you what he did, let me go back and make this point. I tracked between 1710 and 1860, and we had a possible 150 to 200 possible slavery votes. And in all 150 to 200 of them, a black person squealed in every one of them.
Hey, bro, you better go. I'm gone. You're interfering. Go on, get on. Hey. They beat him. Going down to the clay. Look at all these people.
And got his meritorious manumission and his Willie Lynch badge card. And so when Prosper was trying to pull his together, he planned his scheme. And on the day he was supposed to have his big revolt, would you believe one of the most severe storms that had ever hit Virginia came in and washed out most of the land and roads and bridges, and Prosper's group couldn't get together, their gathering point, because they were planning on hitting three things. They were planning on taking over the penitentiary in Richmond, they were planning on taking over the armory, and they were planning on attacking the town and annihilating the town, everybody except the Methodists and the Quakers who had befriended them. And the storm struck just as they were going to assemble. And only 300 showed up, and Prosper said, well, since only 300 of us here, let's put it off until next week when the land is dry and clear. And within 3 days, a black person squealed. Prosper was arrested along with 35 of his supporters. They were executed, hanged, and heads chopped off and put on poles. But the two blacks that did the squealing, one was called Tom, the other was called Pharaoh. And I don't know, God knows it because I don't know. Why is it if you name a black person Tom, you almost guess he's going to do something? Now, I don't know, and I don't mean to put down anybody here named Tom, but I don't know, there's something about that name. And Pharaoh itself is not too much of an exciting name. I wouldn't trust that name either. If somebody, my mother named me Pharaoh, I'd know I'm in a world of trouble too. But anyway, Tom and Pharaoh turned in Prosper. They executed Prosper, chopped his head off, along with some other, and hung him up on poles. But the thing that became very important in that case, though, was that the town was really fearful because they found out from rumors that Prosper had lined up somewhere between 5,000 and 50,000 slaves. The whites all through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina was paralyzed. Their mouths fell open, their eyes they popped, and they said, something is wrong. You mean tell me we put a conditioning system on black folk where we turn everything upside down, and this black guy was able to do the impossible without an education? Something is wrong with our system. What's wrong? And I'm serious. This was a big issue. They had to find out how this one black guy get together as a slave and have something between 5,000 and 50,000 blacks ready to fight, and had not been for a storm, they'd have taken over the country. And finally came out through another rumor, speculations, that what it was that he had beat the symbolism. To show you how important symbols are, that's why I keep telling about powernomics. To get out of your system, sometimes you're lost. You look up at a mountain, you look up at a peak, you look for the Penobscot building or the Empire State Building, you find your symbol, you can find your direction. And what that black Prosper done, he looked at the state seal. The state of Virginia had a seal where it had a white man lying prostrate and a black man's foot on his chest. White and the black guy was called, and in the seal it said, Verticus overcomes Tyrannus. And that black man had used that seal as his motivating force, his guiding light for his people. And when whites found that out, immediately they changed the Virginia seal and said, get rid of that seal fast. And put up guards around the Capitol to make sure it didn't happen again. Now that was in 1800. By 1821, another black named Vesey got equally as concerned. He had heard about it. He said he's going to try it in South Carolina and try another revolt. But Vesey says up front, Vesey organized his group. He walked around, he was a free black. He got free because he bought his own, paid $600 and freed himself. He won money in a lottery. But he was very upset because he couldn't buy his children out of slavery. So Vesey would walk through the town in Charleston, South Carolina, telling black folk, get that hump out of your back, straighten up, be respectful, take care of your own people, look out for your own people, quit trying to worry about everybody and look out for yourselves. And Vesey was a big man too, a big broad man. He said, I'll break your back if I catch you bending over. And he planned an insurrection. And he called something like about 300 to 500 together to take over Charleston, South Carolina. But he told them up front, he said, let me tell you all something. He says, if I catch one black in this group trying to get meritorious manumission, he said, I'm going to snap your neck like a twig. And he planned a revolt. And unfortunately, again, 2 days before his revolt was supposed to occur, not only was he squealed on once, he was squealed on twice. So VC was picked up along with about 37 of his people and hung. Because, again, they sold him out. Then by 1831, Nat Turner, you already know about, tried the same thing a few years later, in 31. Nat Turner says that I'm not even going to go through those changes. I'm not going to do what VC did. I'm not going to do what Prosser did. I'm not even going to play that silly game. He said, what I'm telling you I'm going to do? He said, I'm going to break out of here. I'm getting me a knife, gun, sword, stick, tools, bricks, anything I can get. I'm killing anything I see that moves, crawls, jumps, walks, or talks. That's exactly what I'm quoting him. He says, I'm the rod and staff of God. I'm not playing these silly games. I'm tired. And so Turner started walking, saying he was a sword in the voice of God. He said, I'm going to kill anything I see moving. He killed 55 people, including his own master. And then the country got petrified again and sent the army in looking for him. They searched for Nat Turner for 2 months and couldn't find him. He hid out because he killed so many people. Until one day he needed food and went down to get some blacks to get some food, and guess what happened? Turned them in. And so that took care of Nat Turner. Same time, there's one other black, though, which is my hero. I don't know how much time I got. How much? Long as I want. Okay. Okay, thank you. You see, you all are so nice. That's why I love coming to this city. Boy, I swear. I love you. I'm going to move out here pretty soon. But my hero is John Horace. We start talking about inappropriate behavior versus appropriate behavior. Now, here's a black man at the same time period displayed what I call appropriate behavior. No Rodney King stuff, you see? John Horace was a runaway slave who would also run off to Florida in the early 1800s in the same period when VC and Turner and the rest of them were trying to revolt. John Horace was a big, burly, strong black man. He ran off to Florida. Contrary to what you hear all the time in the media about the Underground Railroad, all blacks trying to get north, get to the promised land. That's a part of that myth. Most blacks weren't that dumb. Why would they want to go all the way across go to the north 1,000 miles through a hostile white country when they could run out to Florida, which is Spanish territory, 20 miles away or 2 feet away? So some of the smarter blacks of our relatives ran off to Florida because that was Spanish territory. And they got down and they interbred and intermixed with the Seminole. Now, you all might ask me why about the Seminoles. Now, Seminoles were also against blacks, a lot of them, but a lot of them were not. Seminoles were the most receptive Indians to do anything with blacks in the country. Why? Because you see, the word Seminole means runaway slave. Okay? And they were also runaways. They interbred with blacks. They were a mixture of blacks. So they were very receptive to black folk. And so they started fighting in that area to fight the United States because the United States, they wanted to go down there and try to get the slaves back. And that's what they were sending General Andrew Jackson to Florida for, to get the slaves. Because you see, blacks down there were coming across the border periodically with the Indians, raiding and killing whites and getting their people free. Now, why is that important? Because you see, when I talked about early inappropriate behavior in Africa, the reason they enslaved black folk originally was because our leaders in Africa had given the impression that I don't care about other black folk. And they hauled all those blacks around the world because they knew in their hearts they would never see a shipload of Africans coming to get them back. They never suspected that Africans would come to save Africans. But that's why they didn't try to enslave Indians, because they knew if they enslaved Indians, Indians would come get their people. But they knew that black leadership in Africa had already said, you can have them, I don't want them, I won't come to get them. And so when the blacks went off into South, into Florida, they were coming across the border, raiding those plantations along Alabama and the Georgia border there, South Carolina border, taking their people, taking them back to down to Florida, getting them free. But John Horse was a leading hero to me. Now this black hooked up, he became sort of like the second in charge in Florida. The chief at that time, through the 1820s and 1830s, was a chief named Osceola. Osceola had about 3 sons that were very active also, fighting white intrusion into Florida to get the slaves back. His number 1 son was a mixture of black and white. His name was Wildcat. And Osceola himself, if you all don't know it, Osceola was married to a black woman. You might see Osceola's pictures in all the museums as an Indian. They don't ever tell you that he was married to a black woman and had a mixed group. And he married to a black woman. His black woman's name was Morning Dew, if you're interested in knowing it. Morning Dew was the one, and that's what triggered the Seminole Wars. They don't tell you that in your history books either. So going back and forth down there, they were trying to get the Indians back. Trying to get the slaves back from the Indians. And they kept sending the federal troops in there. And Andrew Jackson was one of the primary generals that always wanted to go out there and fight Indians. He loved to fight Indians. He's known as the Indian fighter. And that's why you have Jacksonville, Florida. Because he was going in there, again, fighting Indians and trying to get blacks back. And on the Chattahoochee River, right outside Tallahassee, they had a fort there called Fort Negro, where most of the blacks were staying there. And they sent the federal troops down there to get the slaves back. Then the federal boat came up the Chattahoochee River to Fort Negro, and most of the blacks were out with the Indians raiding and fighting, and left the women and kids there. And so the federal troops fired on Fort Negro, 1 shot, and a shot rolled into the armory and set off the explosion and blew up the entire fort, and was nothing in there but black women and children. And that really made them hostile. The blacks were hostile this time. So now, that triggered the Second Seminole War. After that, they decided to have a truce. They said, we'll have a truce if we sit down with Osceola and his warriors, John Horse and the rest of them. And at that point in time, they met. Before they met, they went and kidnapped Morning Dew and told Osceola that if you want your wife back, you better turn some of those black slaves loose and meet with us. And when Osceola went to the meeting to discuss getting his wife back, they kidnapped him and put him in prison. I think up in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. He died of consumption and exposure. And so at that point in time, John Horse and Wildcat went berserk. Then they started fighting. They fought all the way throughout Florida. And finally, they ran them out of Florida. They went out west and led some of that whole movement called the Trail of Tears, all the way out to Oklahoma territory. And but the only people who were fighting in this country against the United States at that time was John Horse and Wildcat and his band of blacks. They had carried their own women and kids with them. That is the only black man in the history of this nation, and I'm sorry to say no school teaches that. That's the only black man in America that's ever stood up to America and fought him, and not as a slave, but as a man. Nobody else has ever done it. John Horse fought the United States for 50 years. They fought him all out west. They chased him all down through the west, through Oklahoma, through Texas, and finally chased him into Mexico. He went into Mexico and stayed there for about 5 or 6 years, and came back again, he and Wildcat. They tried to set up their little village again, but the whites out there, the racists kept raiding their camps, shooting them and killing them. He kept fighting, and they finally killed Wildcat, shot him in the back with a shotgun and killed him. And then John Horse finally just gave up and got on his horse, allegedly, and just rolled off back into Mexico. You never heard from him again. But he fought for 50 years, the only black man. You can talk about any civil rights leader you want to. If you had a hero, that's the only hero we ever had that fought and says, I'm not a slave and I won't take it. I'm not Rodney King or anybody else. And so, they found nobody ever knew what happened to him, but he rolled off. That was John Horse.